So thank you very much for joining us this evening for a virtual book club Q&A with Jack Kelly regarding his book Heaven's Ditch, God, Gold, and Murder on the Erie Canal. If you're not already aware, Jack Kelly is a journalist, novelist, and historian whose books include Band of Giants, that received the DAR History Award Medal. He's also contributed to the Wall Street Journal and other national periodicals, and is a New York Foundation of the Arts Fellow. He's appeared on the History Channel, has been interviewed by National Public Radio. He's also been on the PBS documentary. He spent his childhood in a town along the Canal Corridor, adjacent to Palmyra, and he now lives in New York's Hudson Valley. So he's got a nice list of books that he's published. Line of Sight, Mobtown, Gunpowder, Band of Giants, Heaven's Ditch, The Edge of Anarchy, and we're hoping to hear a little bit tonight about his upcoming book, Velcor, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, coming out next April. And so thank you very much, Jack, for joining us. Thank you very much for letting us use Heaven's Ditch as our very first virtual book club. And really, I appreciate you joining us this evening for this Q&A session. So I'm going to ask if you could just tell us a little bit about your work on the book, the inspiration for it, your process, anything that you might want to share before we get into some questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you, David. Is my audio coming over well?
Yes, yeah, it comes in clear for me.
I really appreciate your organizing this virtual book club, and for anybody who's not familiar with the Schoharie Crossing site, the reason it's Schoharie Crossing was that the Erie Canal, the Schoharie Creek, which is really a river, I would say, had to go over that Schoharie Creek, and it was originally they built a dam and ran the canal into the creek, and then later they put a very impressive aqueduct that went across the creek right near the Mohawk River, and the majority of that aqueduct is still there, and there's an awful lot of history in that area in the Mohawk Valley, and David's done a great job of promoting all the different aspects of the history in the region. As David mentioned, I grew up near the Erie Canal, and writing the book was really sort of a trip into my past. I remember watching the barges go through the locks of the canal. When I used to ride with my family through the town of Palmyra, we would go past Hill Cumorah, which somebody would always invariably say, that's where he found the golden tablets. And for a kid, you know, I didn't know who they were talking about or what the golden tablets were all about, but it sounded pretty intriguing. As I began to do the research for the book, you know, I realized how important the Erie Canal was in American history, and also the importance of some of the religious movements that grew up in the wake of the Erie Canal along the Erie Canal corridor. The actual origin of the book was from a book that came out in the 1940s called The Burned Over District. That's where I really got the idea for it. That book was written by a sociologist named Whitney Cross, and he really pulled together the concept that all these religious movements of the 1820s and 30s and 40s were related and had to do with the ferment that the canal had created along through Western New York. I didn't use the term the burned over district because I thought it was sort of confusing, because what it meant was not that it was burning with religious fervor, but that it was had been burned. There had been so many revivalists had come through there that there was nothing left. The people were kind of burned out. So it was a little bit of a contradictory meaning. So I thought the term was more confusing than it was from a quote from Charles Finney, the great revivalist, but that's where my original idea came from. I didn't write an awful lot about the building of the Erie Canal I thought that had been well covered in many other books, and I just wanted to go on and look at more at these religious movements that were the effect of the canal. And I think the main thing to me was, I like the idea of the visionaries. I like the idea of the canal itself as a kind of vision. The great mix of politics and youth movements and the frontier, and just the stories that if you had written a fiction book about the Millerites and Jemima Wilkinson and even the story of the Mormons, people would have said, well, that's totally unbelievable. But these things actually happen, and they all happen right along in that same region of the country. So that was, I think also that just the audacity of the building of the canal and of the creation of these do-it-yourself religions, there was something very appealing about that, and I found it great interest. That's, in general, that's my take on the book, and I'm happy to get into the questions, and I would encourage anybody who has any questions or anything you want to know more about, just put them in your web chat.
Yeah, so that's a great point. You can send us comments or questions during this. We had fielded some questions that came in during our check-ins, or that were emailed or otherwise sent to us through Facebook on our messenger. So we put those up on this PowerPoint to be able to ask. But if there's additional questions, maybe some follow-up questions you might have, use that chat feature, send those along, and we can fit those in, or maybe they'll otherwise be covered while we're answering these questions. So the first one for Jack was, how did you develop the descriptions of people you discuss in the book, from the physical details to the character traits and emotional or spiritual picture that you demonstrate for each of them? Is there a little bit of like fictional crafting that goes into that, or writer's license, and how you portray them in their settings?
I think that as far as descriptions, there are drawings and paintings of people like Joseph Smith. There's we get into in the latter part, there's actual photographs, but a lot of these movements were covered in the press, and the personalities were a big deal. And so there are descriptions at how they looked. And I suppose there's a synthetic taking everything into consideration and coming up with my take on who the person was. But I try to have at least some kind of root in the actual historical record. For example, Joseph Smith, the Mormon Church has been very, very transparent in producing all of Joseph Smith's writings, and they're available in his own handwriting, and then with transcription. So it's fairly easy to get a pretty good idea of who he was just from his daily diaries and his letters, and some of the other characters the same way. So I think hopefully everything has at least some basis in reality.
Great. I like that. There's obviously a lot more that goes into the writing of a book like this than what makes it onto each page. So kind of coming up with that. I'm glad that this question was kind of posed, and that you explain it in that way. And speaking of Smith, one of the things that kind of this question invoked was in the earlier chapters when you're describing him as a boy, and sort of like the smell, as he's climbing into bed at night. Essentially, it kind of layers in this extra sort of a sense of place, or a sense of being there as well. So this question kind of makes me think about those aspects within the writing, where you can take that factual information and be able to, for lack of a better term, on the page, paint a picture of what it would have possibly been like during that point in time.
Yeah, I think that, some of it is trying to put yourself into the time. There's no accounts of the smell of Joseph Smith's bedroom, but if you sort of immerse yourself into the culture and the way things were back in those days and the amount of bathing that went on, there was a certain smell of that pervaded things.
Right. Yeah. A little bit later on, you touch about that when it comes to the way of the canal. And that's something I try to reinforce with particularly fourth grade groups of you can't imagine what it would have smelled like on a hot August day waiting to get through this lock with your annoying, siblings around you on a canal boat and the number of people and the draft animals. So once you put it in that context for them, they get really excited about it. Because anyway, so the next question. Do you feel that the country has experienced another public works project that has had the same impact socially as the Erie Canal?
I would have to say no. I may be a little biased on that, but I think that the impact of the canal in its day was enormous, both in the opening up of Western New York and then of the Great Lakes region, the flood of people that started moving west at that time. It was really the first big breakthrough through the Appalachian mountain chain that people could move easily out to the west. I always try to point out, the travel to the west before the Erie Canal was like a once in a lifetime thing. If you went out west, and some people did at that time, out on the frontier, you didn't expect to come back. You didn't expect your family to come visit you. You were going west, and that was it. After the canal was finished, you could go out and live in Ohio or Illinois even, and if you decided you didn't like it, you could go back, or you could go back for a visit to see your family, or your family could come out and visit you. It made travel so much easier. So it had many effects like that. It certainly commerce exploded. It had a great effect on New York City. And as I mentioned in the book, that the fact that New England people and immigrants were the main people that went out to the Great Lakes region, it really solidified that northern Midwest as a non-slave holding territory. So it began the split of the country from north to south. I think the only public works that would come close to it would probably be the interstate highway system. That certainly has had an enormous effect on the country. If you can imagine the amount of trucks that go up and down the interstate highway system, before that was built, they went on local roads. So tremendous effect on transportation. Some pretty unfortunate effects on the cities, the way that the interstate intruded on cities. And interestingly, in Rochester, when the canal used to go through the center of Rochester, and it was rerouted when they built the barge canal, and the former route of the Erie Canal is now a spur of the interstate system. So I guess that would be my answer to that one.
Very good. All right. And this one, I put in here, there's been a few people that have made a few comments, but there's some reviews of the book that comment on the style and layout chapter to chapter, one stating, as a reader, you will be more or less there for the ride. So the curiosity is, how have you come on the way that you shape the story? It's kind of put a few people use the term that you zigzag or hop back and forth between topics and characters as you progress through the book.
Yeah, well, that's very true. And it was something I thought quite a bit about before I started writing, I'm really trying to tell a series of separate stories that are interrelated, but are unique and are unique in themselves. The story of the Mormons, the story of the Millerites, the story of the building of the canal. But I thought by mixing them up and moving from one to another, rather than tell the whole story of the building of the canal and then move on to the story of the Mormons, that I would give a sense of the interrelated, you know, a lot of the stories overlapped in time, and they had intersections in terms of the what went on as well, influences of the Shakers, how the Shakers influenced the Mormons and so forth. That it would give a better picture of that time of the ferment and the this whole expanse of activity that was going on simultaneously. And the other thing I think that was important to me was I always tried, you know, when we look at history, we often look in the rearview mirror and say, well, this is what happened. When we're living through history, the people that lived through history in the past, it's a question of suspense. They don't know what's coming. So we're approaching an election in 2 months. We're in suspense about what's the outcome going to be. A year from now, we'll look back and say, well, that was the outcome. So I wanted to give that sense of moving through the events of this period. What happened to William Morgan? Is the body that floated up in Lake Ontario Morgan's body, and leave a certain element of suspense in there so that you can experience it a little bit the way people did at the time. So that was my intention, at least. I don't know exactly what it means. You're more or less there for the ride. I don't know what else you would be there for.
Right, right, and I'm glad you explained it that way. That's the way I took it in my first reading of it, which happened several years ago. That I was privileged enough to be able to read one of the the publisher had sent me a draft of it before it was published, and I had some sense of it because correct me if I'm wrong, the book previous to that, Band of Giants, kind of lays out amongst the characters a way where you're kind of moving back and forth between the characters along the timeline of the revolution. And so to me, it didn't seem all that surprising. And I'm glad that you're mentioning that it's almost like this, not frenetic, but this change of pace that's going on. So reading Heaven's Ditch is that experience where you don't know the outcome yet, and you're kind of popping back and forth. And that maybe gives a sense of how rapidly change is happening in New York and in the country at that point in time, between the 1830s and 40s in particular. That's how I interpret it in my reading of it, and the way that I explain it when I've had. We did a book club in real life with the Arkell Museum and Canada Library way back in 2017 with this book, and similar comments were brought up. And so I'm glad to have your response to that as well. And I hopefully if there's anybody that has read this book that's on for this program, having that explanation makes it more sensical to them, or makes it work. Because to me, I particularly the suspense part, it gets you to keep on reading it. It's kind of hard to stop at a couple of chapters. So.
Well, that's, you know, and that's my background as a novelist. That's really what I'm aiming at, is to, you know, to have a readable book more than to just catalog the information.
Right. The next question, during your author's comments that you provided us, you mentioned how the Morgan case led to a paranoid style of American politics, and in what ways did the anti-Mason party promote paranoia of Freemasonry?
Well, I think that this question got me thinking, because I'm always trying to have some relevance. You know, I think history has lessons to teach, and the more you can see how it applies to contemporary life, the more relevance it has. So in this case, I think, and perhaps by chance, we happen to be in one of the most paranoid periods, I think, in American history right now. And so if you look back to the Morgan case, the idea of the paranoid style of American politics was a term that was coined by historian Richard Hofstadter in 1960. I think he wrote an essay about it, in which he mentioned the Morgan case as a predecessor of this style. But he was mainly concerned about the McCarthy era of the 1950s and the paranoia of that era. But I think if you look at the Morgan case, it wasn't so much that Morgan's or the anti-Masonic movement gave rise to this style, but it was an example of it in the sense that there was a kernel of truth, a seed of truth. Morgan was abducted, and that was then turned into this hyperbole of um, the idea that the Freemasons were going to take over the American government. And then it brings in fear, it brings in division between factions, so that there was fistfights on the streets of Rochester over the Morgan's abduction, disappearance. It brings in this solidification of people's ideas so that there's no room for compromise. The repetition of lies that you see in both in the Morgan case and seeing today. The idea of secrecy. One of the factors in the Morgan case was that the Freemasons were a secret organization. Everybody thought that was something very suspicious about them. And what you're seeing today in this, what we now call conspiracy theory, but is really just this paranoid style, is either I know a secret and you don't know it, or maybe you know a secret and I don't know it. But in either case, it fuels the paranoia and the idea of a conspiracy. And I think another kind of parallel you could say is that the media of the 1830s, which was mainly newspapers, was divided just as the way that some of the TV networks now are divided into very partisan groupings, or take a very partisan point of view. Newspapers would be an anti-Masonic newspaper, or they would be support the Masons, and they would run their own propaganda. So that element of the media was true in the days of Morgan as well. Also, the rallies, they had many mass meetings over the Morgan case, and they eventually had the first presidential political convention was actually invented by the Freemason Party. So that's, I think is really is something, to me, it makes some aspects of the book more relevant to today.
Yes, yeah, I'll agree, and I think that it's good timing on the selection of this book as we lead into the unknown next couple of months. I won't comment too much further on that. Next question. Why do you think the western end of the canal seemed more of a base for the social reform like women's rights and abolitionist movement? What about those movements in the eastern end through the Mohawk Valley and in the Albany area?
Well, I think that in general, the western end was a little bit more fertile for change because it was newer. It was really the coming of the canal that really created cities like Syracuse and Rochester and Buffalo. It was newer. The people out there were younger. It was more open, and they were open to the new ideas. Whereas the eastern end and the Mohawk Valley had been settled for quite a long time, but before the canal was built, and had an established culture and had an established religion. That was when I was writing my current book, I came across the fact that during the Revolutionary era, which was not that long before the Erie Canal, everybody in Albany spoke Dutch. You would rarely hear Dutch spoken in Albany in the 1780s and 90s. And I'm sure there's still plenty of Dutch speakers there then. They had the Dutch Reformed Church. It was an established a long-established city, and so was less susceptible to the excitement and the change that came about more on the western end of the canal.
And the next question, do you think it was the radical nature of groups like Shakers or the United Community that wasn't just the appeal to youth, but also the reason they failed to last? Or do you think maybe it was more in their form of organization or beliefs? And this question came in. I know you don't really speak too much, or if at all, really in the book about the United Community, but I know there's references to the Shakers and the influence. So if you want to field this one.
Yeah, I think it raises an interesting point, which is why did some movements last and other movements didn't? I wouldn't accept that for the Shakers that they didn't last very long. The Shakers, I think Ian Lee came to United States, or was like colonies at the time, in 1774, and founded the Shakers. They really had their peak in the 1820s through the Civil War. They declined somewhat after the Civil War, but they continued well into the 20th century. So it was not a short-lived movement. I understand there are two Shakers left up in Maine today that are the last remnants of Shaker. I don't know if they're still shaking, but they're up there. And so it was, was it the radicalism? The Shakers were pretty radical. The United Community was radical. The Mormons were radical. The Mormons were also a very long-lived sect. So I don't think it was so much the radicalism as the personalities, and the Shakers had it. And the second part of the question, the form and organization of the beliefs, is really more crucial. That the Shakers had a well-organized system for their communities. The Oneida community was more of a personality cult. They had as you mentioned, I didn't write about this in the book, but there was a man named John Humphrey Noyes who led the Oneida community, and it was really a free love community. And he himself got a little too free with the free love, I guess, had to go off to Canada. He tried to put his son into power. Turned out his son was an agnostic. He didn't even believe entirely in God, so it was not a very good choice for a religious leader. And the community declined pretty quickly into a silver company. But whereas another example that I did talk about in the book was Jemima Wilkinson, also a kind of personality cult. That once Jemima Wilkinson was gone, she had a pretty substantial movement while she was alive, but once she was gone, the movement declined. I think all this would point to the great genius of Joseph Smith, who was himself a very charismatic figure, very important in the founding and growth of the church. But he did put in place structures that were both hierarchical in the church and also civil structures for the Mormon communities, so that when he was gone and was murdered at a fairly young age, the church continued and was, one of the most successful of all the movements that came out of that era. So I think that each one is really have to look at each one and see why it continued and why it might have died out.
Very good. Next question. If you could provide, you kind of, I think, touched on this a little bit when discussing Paranoid style, but if you could provide any sort of thoughts or comments on how this era of the 1830s and 1840s compares to America in the 1960s.
I think I think there's some interesting parallels. The questioning of the establishment, the sort of shifting culture, the predominance of youth culture. Um, I think it's interesting in that in the 1830s, religion was a much more important aspect of culture than it was in the 1960s. So it was the movements that came up in the 1830s and 40s tended to be in some way focused on religion, and not that was not so much true in the 1960s. So communes, for example, there were communes in the 1830s, the Shakers being one of them. Jemima Wilkinson was another commune, but in the communes in the 1960s were more were not really direct descendants of those because they weren't connected with religion. But I think it's an interesting, character like um, uh, Theodore Dwight Weld, who was the great early abolitionist, was very much a type of character that you could see knocking around in the 1960s, and preaching a radical set of beliefs.
So it wouldn't be a far
Interesting
cry to get
parallels.
it wouldn't be a far cry to get an image of Weld and create a sticky for your Volkswagen minivan and drive it across country with him hanging out in the back then.
Yeah, I think that's a good depiction.
Next question. Money digging is mentioned as not just a wishful source of wealth, but as a form of entertainment akin to playing the lottery today. And what other ways do you feel that might connect to the entertainment culture of America today?
Um, well, that is, I think that is an analogy, certainly, that people play the lottery because it's fun. It's not so much a way to get rich. If you look at the odds, your chances of getting rich are pretty slim. But it's just fun to play the lottery or do the scratch offs. Um, and that was the parallel to the money digging. I think as far as entertainment goes, there was a great shortage of entertainment, a great hunger for entertainment in those days. I mentioned in the book Sam Patch, who jumped over Niagara Falls, and he jumped over the falls in Rochester on the Genesee River. Thousands and tens of thousands of people came, and they traveled for days to watch this guy jump over the falls. That indicates to me a great hunger for some kind of entertainment. And I think it was from living out on the frontier, having this terrible, desperate work that they had to do to turn the frontier and to turn forests into farms, that they were up for any kind of entertainment, anything that was different. The same thing with the camp meetings, the religious camp meetings. People traveled for days to get to them to see, and the preachers understood this, and they put on a show, and the camp meetings were a real show because they knew that people were looking for a show. So, and I would say, another aspect of his entertainment thing was the tourism. Um, some of the structures of the canal were themselves tourist attractions. The flight of locks at Lockport, or the Irondequoit Creek embankment, or the various aqueducts along the way, were structures people hadn't seen anything like that before. But even more important was people went up to see Niagara Falls before the canal was. It would have been a very difficult trip to make it up to Niagara Falls, but people had heard about it, and they could now take advantage of the canal and go out and see Niagara Falls. And Niagara Falls began to really boom after the canal was finished.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the tourism aspect of it. And there's several travel journals that are out there. You reference a few, I think Dickens and Hawthorne in particular, and um, people taking it as a vacation on the canal or coming from Europe to travel and have that experience. So that the entertainment culture, almost globally becomes kind of this draw toward the canal. And I'm glad you brought up Sam Patch, because in looking at a lot of the questions that were coming in, there weren't really a lot that kind of pertained to his aspect of the book. And from my reading of that, you take the as you mentioned, thousands or tens of thousands of people coming to watch him jump. And it's almost like this morbid curiosity if he's going to make it or not. There's the entertainment of it, and there's probably a very festival-like atmosphere that goes around with it. But I also see that as, and in some of the check-ins that are available, where I make mentions where he was sort of that early form of almost that labor movement, and it kind of, you can look at him as this boy working in a mill that finds excitement and kind of a way out of that through his jumping. And then some of the comments that I find in the book sort of lead that as this development as we lead beyond perhaps this religious revivalism in America that leads to transformation in society. And we look at everything from abolitionism and women's rights and labor movements. And I think that to me, Sam Patch winds up becoming just as much of an icon of the entertainment as much as, or perhaps more now in rereading the book, as an early look at labor in America.
Yeah, I would agree with that, David. I think that it's all sort of goes into the ferment that was going on at that time, that there's so much change. We always tend to, I think that we live in the time of change. Other people lived in the big past where nothing changed, things change very slowly. But in fact, that era there was a lot of change going on. Industrialism was just beginning to come in, and how are we going to accommodate industrialism? And that was sort of what Sam Patch was all about. It's like, how do you, he rebelled against just going into the mill and working. And he tried to make his living doing something else. So there's a lot of connections through the culture that make it for a very interesting time. A time that one of the things that I thought about before I started writing the book was, this is a period of time between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War that usually you skip over in history class in a one or two lessons, because nothing much happened during that. And actually, a lot was happening.
Absolutely, yeah. That's U.S. History 1 ends about 1800, and pick up at 1850s Fugitive Slave Act leading into the Civil War, and you miss a good 50 years of America coming up with its identity, which is
very much the adolescence of America, I think.
Right. Nobody wants to remember their teenage years. But you also brought up the revivals in answering this question, and that leads me to Charles Finney. Was it Joshua Himes really kind of comes up with this visual marketing, essentially, this visual aspect within the revivals that I had mentioned again in one of the check-ins. And so the idea of that shout and feel and being able to be moved as sort of, there's a religiosity to it, but there's also an entertainment to it. But I really like the part where it becomes a visual aspect through the use of those large paintings and murals. And it's almost, I'm not trying to compare it so much to what would eventually evolve later on in the century with circus, but there becomes a very theater aspect of it by bringing in almost like set dressing with these murals. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you have to keep in mind that people in those days had not seen images, particularly the people out along the frontier, had never seen images whatsoever. It wasn't just that they didn't have television or movies or any kind of moving pictures. They didn't have pictures at all. They didn't have photographs. Most of them didn't have paintings. They couldn't afford them. So to see any image was an experience. It's hard for us who are overwhelmed with images to go back and understand what the impact was. The Millerites did have these fantastical diagrams and paintings. The revival of churches, as you mentioned, was really made up as a really a theatrical experience. The minister standing up in the high pulpit and declaiming in a vast church that's lit only by candles and lamps. Very, very impressive to people. And that has been true. It's not just this period, but it's been true all through history. And it's really only in the latter part of the 20th century we've been finally overindulged in images. Up until that time, people were much more sensitive to seeing images, much more influenced by the visual and the like you say, the theatrical aspects of everything, really.
This, I believe, is the last one that we had that came in, and this person must have done a little bit of research or gone back through or remember there was an interview with Joe Donahue of WAMC, and also mentioning it was also mentioned in your author's commentary, infrastructure in America was brought up and how it impacts society. You voiced thoughts on how it seems Americans have lost the quote gumption or idealism to improve infrastructure for the public good. Why might this be in the case that we've lost that foresight? How do you see the change from the early republic to today and its views on public works projects?
This is another area that I think has a relevance. The history of that time has a relevance to today. It's interesting to me that looking and doing my research that, for example, the terminology in the days of the Erie Canal, what we might call public works were referred to as internal improvements. The term public works then came up and was most widely used in the 1920s and 30s during the New Deal. There was a lot of talk of public works. It declined through the 50s and 60s. And by the 80s, we had the term infrastructure. And the idea of infrastructure was to take the public out of public works. And this idea, why are we in an infrastructure crisis, as we are assured we are? There's roads, bridges, electrical grids, schools, every aspect of public life in America needs improvement, needs more maintenance, needs to be renewed, and we're not doing it. And so a lot of engineers and a lot of people that study, public sphere say that this is a crisis of infrastructure. Every president talks about infrastructure improvements, nobody does it. And why is that? It's somewhat of a mystery, but I think a lot of it does go back to the idea that came up during the 1980s and 1990s of what Ronald Reagan said: the government is the problem. The government is not the solution to your problems. The government is the problem, and the small government versus big government argument, or the balance between those two things, which certainly went all the way back to the Erie Canal. There was a lot of debate over who should pay for it and should it be done and so forth. There was tended to be a balance between the big government and small government that in the 1980s began to slip very much towards the small government view of things. And unfortunately, there are infrastructure projects that can only be done by the government. They're just not, they don't have the return on investment that is required for a private company to go in and private companies don't have the wherewithal to invest to that extent for a return that might take decades to realize. And so things languish. And I think we look back at the Erie Canal, there was people gave a lot of thought to it, and they came up with the idea of government contractors, where the private sector would do the work, but the government would plan and implement and finance. We're not seeing that now. So it's to me one of the more serious problems that's connected with this whole idea of the Erie Canal is, for example, our energy economy needs to be changed. It's just required. It has to be changed. But it's an expensive proposition, and we've largely given it over to China, which has a little bit longer view of things, to provide a lot of the technology for wind and solar and other energy the elements of the new energy economy. I certainly don't have a solution to it, but I think it's interesting to look back and compare what happened in 1820 and compare it to today.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the values in history, obviously, is making it relevant, as you mentioned before. If you can't see a reflection of ourselves in the past, then it's almost a lost cause at that point. But what I'd like to do is, I believe that was the last question, but there might be a few in the chat. So I'm gonna bring that over here just a little bit so I can read it better. So there's I don't know if there's quite so much of a question here, but there's a comment about, when you look at the past, there was not a uniform support for internal improvements, politically divided people. So that's,
Yeah,
to me,
well,
that.
yeah, I think that's a very good point. It wasn't, it isn't a black and white question. It's all one or all the other. As I mentioned, that they did have private contractors that made money off of digging the Erie Canal, but it was organized by the state of New York. And there were plenty of arguments, as there's bound to be, about any spending of public money. Where are you going to spend it? Who's going to benefit from it? The decisions are politically fraught, but we need to have that working out of the politics, not to say, well, let's just not do it then. Let's just not do the infrastructural spending because we can't figure out the politics of it. To me, that's somewhat short-sighted.
Right. And I like when this kind of topic comes up about the funding or the lead into building the canal. And the previous exhibit at Schoharie Crossing, I believe when you had stopped out several years ago and we first met, there was called Little Short of Madness, taken from the quote of Thomas Jefferson saying it's little short of madness to think of it this day. Our new exhibit, Pathway to Empire, has a few other Jefferson quotes, but you can see that transformation in his mind where he's basically saying, it was little short of madness. And then there's another quote saying that, you've engaged upon this infrastructure work, and it will basically, transform the state. It's a great benefit if you're able to do it. And then there's a quote close to the end of his life and nearing the completion of the canal, where he's writing to DeWitt Clinton, saying that you were very lucky. I'm paraphrasing here. You're very lucky to be coming from a state that has the ability and the foresight to see that the public good is a common good, or the common good is an individual good, and that for people to go forth on this project, that it's going to benefit people individually, but as a collective. And again, I'm paraphrasing that. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but I think that that's something that you make a good point. The projects that were public or private stock companies or investment oriented versus those that became a government project, and the difference of the 1820s to today, a couple hundred years later. Well, there's a lot of things that have changed. So there's a comment somebody had chimed in when talking about the Shakers. You'd mentioned there's a couple people living up in Maine. They say that Shakers still exists. There are 3 people living currently in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. And that does kind of, that sounds familiar to me with a few of the programs I've been to about Shakers, and a Shaker exhibit that existed a few years ago at the New York State Museum, I believe, had some information on that as well. So
Yeah, that I have checked a few times since I wrote the book to see that they're still alive up there. They're fairly elderly people, but there's two or three live in a settlement that they had up in Maine. Interesting, people always say the Shakers were celibate, and that's sort of implying that that's why they died out. Um, they originally adopted a lot of children, and sometime during the 20th century, I'm not sure exactly when, a law was passed that prevented religious groups from uh, adopting children as a group. So the children would be brought into the religion by being essentially collectively adopted by the religious group. And that was one of the things that really contributed to the Shakers' decline, because they were, they would adopt orphans and raise them as Shakers, and they would replenish their ranks, but that ended.
all right. And so the comment coming in as a follow-up from that, from Sharon, who had mentioned that, stating, so you must be familiar with this community. Says Brother Arnold's in his 60s, Sister June is in about 80, and Brother Andrew is in his 30s or 40s. The majority of the children did not choose to stay, or either that they would have. It's interesting for me to see this, and I'll have to look into it a little more myself. That there'd be somebody in their 30s and 40s, so that's quite interesting. I know there's a few historic sites. There's a down in the Albany area. There's one, and there's a Hancock Shaker Village that speaks about their history as well. That are worthwhile for anybody that's looking for a historic site to visit, especially if they've already visited Schoharie Crossing and they're looking for some other things in the region.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the Shakers were really on the forefront of women's liberation, so to speak, in the early part of the 19th century, and a lot of the attraction was for women that were escaping husbands that beat them up, or were just looking for somewhere where they didn't have to get married. They could join the Shakers, and they had equal power, and that was always true in the Shaker communities.
Little radical in the day, but I think that fits a lot better into our perhaps, maybe at risk of saying something here, but it fits a little bit more into what we see ourselves as of today, on equality. So I'm not saying other questions popping up, and I'm super grateful for your time, Jack. I'm super happy for everybody joining in. Again, I love, even though WebEx is sort of an interesting format to have to do this, it is a way to still be able to connect with people and to have been able to offer kind of an engagement back and forth about this book. Again, I think that people, if they haven't read it and they are chiming in, they should go and pick it up. And it's a great thing to have on your shelf. You can pick it up and read it again, share it with friends and family. I enjoyed the reading the first time, the second time, and now this third time where I've gone through and looked at it in a slightly different way because of this book club. And I appreciate you writing it. I appreciate you allowing us to use it for the book club and your time this evening. So I also want to mention, since I have people here that might be interested in that we do have some more information out there on the internet for you, Jack Kelly. Is jackkellybooks.com still a good location for people to find out more what's going on?
Yeah, that's that book will be coming out in April, and I think it's I call it the most important unknown battle of the Revolutionary War, and I explain why it's important and why it's unknown.
Great. And that's also, I'll have to pick up a copy and read it, and then perhaps take a venture not too far north from here and check out the area around Belcour Island, and probably stopping at Whitehall. Check out the museum there.
Yeah,
as well.
Whitehall, Ticonderoga, of course, is another great site. And it's just a beautiful, rather remote, but beautiful section of the country up there, and where it all happened, which was Lake Champlain.
All right. And so we don't want to give away too many spoilers. Things kind of worked and did not work out, but overall, it saved the cause of liberty. So when this comes out, folks will be able to read that, and maybe we'll have a conversation next year about the importance of Elcor.
That'd be great.
All right. Let's see, and just if anybody's still around on the line here, and in case Jack wants to join in on this book club as well, the next one will be in October. Everything Worthy of Observation. Paul Schneider has edited and annotated the 1826 New York State Travel Journal of Alexander Stuart Scott. You can find that Excelsior editions. It's online, Amazon. Some local libraries have it. You can order that. More information will be coming out on that one. That'll be our book club selection for October. And just want to give that a quick plug. And thank you so much for joining us. Jack Kelly, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom.
Thanks, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. It's been fun.
Right. Take care, and thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Okay.